This is Trend Following Radio, where great thinking comes alive. Nobel Prize winners, legendary traders, best-selling authors, and the pros that know what drive us irrational human beings. I am your host, Michael Covel. Not filtered, raw, honest. That's my passion. I want to share some perspective on starting anything. And I'm going to use as an example my podcast. This podcast was started in January of 2012. On a lark, I just decided to do it. Years earlier, I had put very short podcast episodes up on iTunes, and then there was literally a 5-year break. And then in January 2012, I decided long form. Of course, given my background, I went down the trading path. Many trading guests. And I went down that path all the way until early 2013. In early 2013, I was hired by CLSA, a brokerage firm out of Hong Kong. I traveled Asia for 4 months. Essentially, from February 2013 through May of 2013. And of course, I've never really left Asia. I have found it to be quite the experience and an interesting challenge for my podcast as well, primarily because of times. I'm usually 11 hours plus East Coast America, half the year 11 hours plus, half the year 12 hours plus. But the interesting story I want to tell today was my decision. Somewhere in Asia, summer 2013, I decided that I wanted to expand my podcast. I wanted to have more than just traders on. Now, I had had a few guests here and there that were beyond trading, but now I really had this urge to go beyond. Now, not entirely beyond. I wanted the experts that brought a tangential point of view to where I was going with my trading. Professionals, people that have really done the homework and research that could buttress where I go with my work. One of the guests that I decided that I wanted was Dan Ariely, a professor at Duke, a behavioral economics finance expert, a guy that most of you have probably read at least one of his books. I reached out to Dan that summer of 2013, and he said, sure, he'll do an interview, but not until the semester was over. So for that whole fall of 2013, I was quite excited because I really thought Dan Ariely would be that jumping off point for me to get to the next level of where I wanted to go with my podcast. Again, I'm a guy that's had some success, but in the trading space, and I had this feeling, this desire, I wanted to jump across the river and go to a slightly different place. So Dan says yes, summer of 2013. I wait until December, we do our interview. Now, in the meantime, while I was waiting for Dan, episode 178, I reached in and I interviewed Vernon Smith. I had met Vernon, who won the Nobel Prize, shared that Nobel Prize with Daniel Kahneman in 2002. I met Vernon during the taping of my film documentary, Broke, The New American Dream. So while I was waiting for Dan that fall of 2013, Vernon agreed to appear. Now, I had also asked, right around the time that I had asked Dan that summer of 2013, I asked Daniel Kahneman, who shared the Nobel Prize with Vernon Smith. I did not get a response from Daniel Kahneman at that moment. And look, this is just some of the sausage making that goes in to doing an endeavor, any entrepreneurial endeavor. It's going to be ups, downs, starts this way, that way. You never know exactly where it's going to end up or go, but you just go and follow the trend. So while waiting for my scheduled interview, December of 2013 with Dan Ariely, not having a response from Daniel Kahneman, then unexpectedly getting Vernon Smith to agree to a podcast appearance. Again, that would be episode 178 with Vernon Smith. And then also, while waiting for Dan Ariely, Gerd Gigenrenzer appeared on my show, episode 193. And it just so happens, Dan Ariely became episode 194 right after Gerd. So in the course of just a few months, 3 of the just brilliant minds in this behavioral space appeared on my show. At that moment in time, I'm thinking, I can go somewhere different with this. Now, not altogether different, because the work of those three men surely buttress many of the themes in my work. But now I'm excited. Now I've interviewed Vernon Smith, Gerd Gigerenzer, and Dan Ariely. But I still wanted Daniel Kahneman on my show. But I had not got a response. Being the enterprising soul that I am, once Vernon Smith had appeared on my show, and Dan had appeared on my show, and Gerd had appeared on my show, I then reached back out to Daniel Kahneman, and I gave him a link to my episode with Vernon Smith. Daniel Kahneman wrote back this time and said, sure, I'll do your podcast. Now, I'm not saying that everyone out there with a podcast is going to be lucky enough to get Daniel Kahneman to appear on your show. But I will say, the moment Daniel Kahneman appeared, and those other three guys, extremely proficient, extremely astute in their knowledge. But once Daniel Kahneman appeared, the gates just opened. And that, for me, was the boom, I can go in any direction on this show. With the caveat that any direction still has to come back to a theme, a thought process that I believe in. And to this day, in 2016, I still believe that, and I still strive for that. Now, some of you out there might be thinking to yourself, 2013, 2014, 2015, if it didn't happen yesterday, it's not worthy of me. One thing you can be sure of, for the vast majority of my episodes, I've not been a topical guy. I don't try to have my episode be about what is happening at that moment in time. My motivation is different, an entirely different motivation than the daily blather on a CNBC or a Bloomberg or Yahoo Finance. I want to have timeless content. I want the content that appears on my show to last. That's a huge driver for me. So in the spirit of celebrating behavior, what drives all of us deeply irrational creatures, I want to play a few clips that I've curated that I think will really help to exemplify the best of the men that I've just mentioned. First, Dan Ariely.
Behavioral economists are interested in the same topics that economists are interested in. Why people buy, how we make decisions, what are the right mechanisms in the market, and so on. But the starting point is different. Rather than assuming people are rational and then take the implications of that, we have no prior beliefs. We say, let's just see how people behave. Let's put them in a situation in the lab, in the field. Let's see how they behave. And then as a consequence, let's make the implication. And because in those situations, people often don't behave rationally, the implications are often very different from the implications from standard economics. So there are many examples, of course, for irrationality. There's one way to be rational and many ways to be irrational. We exhibit lots of those. A good way to think about it is to think about emotions. So think about it. Imagine that you were in the jungle 20,000 years ago and you saw a tiger. What do you want? Do you want a human being in that situation to stop, to pause, to think, to take out a little Excel spreadsheet and calculate, what should I do? Should I run? Should I stay? What's the cost? What's the benefit? Of course not. What you want is to create a situation in which this person runs as fast as they can the moment they see the tiger. And that's basically how emotions work. When we see something that puts us in danger or have to do something with our sexual behavior, we turn our cognition off. It's not that we think and we feel, we just feel. Emotion take over, and then they just execute a command. Say, run as fast as you can, don't think, don't calculate, don't do anything. Now, emotions still work in the same way these days, even though we don't have tigers. But now they're evoked by other things. Somebody cut in front of us in the highway, we have some anger towards somebody in customer service upsets us, all kinds of other things happen. Emotions just work in the same way, even though nowadays they are not as relevant to those situations. There is hope, and I think the hope basically has kind of multiple legs to it. The first thing is that I'm hoping that when people see a mistake that they know about it, they might be able to fix it. So for example, it turns out that free is a very big allure. When we see something that is free, we often go for it even if it's not good for us. But it turns out that if it wasn't free, if it was costing us a penny or 10 cents or $1, we will not have the same allure to it. So one of the suggestions I have to people is when something is free, ask yourself, would I still do the same thing even if it was costing me a penny or 10 cents? And there's a range of those things. There's a range of things in which we can read a paper or a book or kind of have an idea about what are some irrational behaviors that other people are exhibiting. And of course, it's always easy for us to see what other people are exhibiting irrationalities, and then use it as a mirror and say, oh, I can see this behavior. I see that when I date, I juggle too many options. I see that when I shop, I make this mistake. I see when I make these mistakes, and let me think about how to prevent it. So that's the first hope. The second hope is for things that we would do that would prevent us from getting into this mistake. So, for example, have you ever gone to lunch when you were vowing to be on a diet and then the waiter comes with a chocolate souffle and you say, today I'll have the chocolate souffle? Of course, we all do it. We do it repeatedly. Surprisingly, how repeatedly? Or have you ever had a situation in which you said, I'm going to only practice safe sex, I really don't want any STDs, and then you come to the moment of temptation and the thought about condom, going to get it and so on is just not high on your priorities. Happens very often. Now in those cases, it's not something you can at the moment fix. You can't see the chocolate souffle or be sexually aroused and say, oh, let me fix that. I understand this is an irrational behavior. So in those situations, what we need to do is to think ex ante and try to prevent ourselves from doing that. And there's a whole range of those things. We could say, I know that I don't like to exercise, so let me create appointments with friends so that they will force me to go. I know I have a tendency to have unprotected sex. Let me have condoms with me even if I don't think it's necessary. Or let me tell the waiter at the beginning of the meal, let me ask them not to show me the dessert tray.
Dan just brings that pragmatic view to get regular people to think about the notion of behavior, what drives us, how it's exemplified, how we can do better. A very optimistic guy. Next, I want you to hear a clip from Vernon Smith. As mentioned earlier, Vernon won the Nobel Prize in 2002, shared that Nobel Prize with Daniel Kahneman. Vernon won that prize for something called experimental economics. He went into the lab and he figured out how do people respond in markets? What is driving them? Because it's sure as hell not fundamentals. People deviate from the fundamentals all the time. And Vernon was able to document this in a way that no one had documented before.
I started out primarily doing experiments in markets. And my first appointment was at Purdue University. I was teaching principles of economics, and I realized that there was nothing in my education that enabled me to understand the connection between economic theory, supply and demand theory, theory of markets, and what people actually do in markets, the decisions they make day by day. So I decided that at the beginning of the next semester, I would when I was teaching principles, I would start out, and with the first class, I would do an experiment. They were not yet contaminated by economic theory. They didn't know any economics. They would be completely naive. I created there were buyers and sellers, and by assigning values to the buyers, costs to the sellers, with the understanding that they would earn the difference, the buyers would earn the difference between the value I gave them and the price they pay in the market. And the sellers would earn the difference between the price at which they sold and their lowest price willingness to sell, which we call the cost. And so that's exactly like people. We imagine people in markets. You see, why do you pay $100 per pair of shoes?
Because
you like the shoes more than
$100.
$100. How much more? Well, people are vague about that. Now, if you go to an auction market, a so-called English or buyer's bid market, what happens? The prices start out low, and there's lots and lots of bidders. The prices rise, and people drop out, and there's only one left, and the item is awarded to that person. That tells you right away the law of demand, that people have maximum amounts they're willing to pay that they discover, they find out. So we just created that in this the classroom. And I had them just shout out bids and asks, and they traded. And then I repeated it Monday, Tuesday. You imagine a daily markets. These would last about 5 minutes. Prices converged to the competitive equilibrium, the intersection of the supply and demand.
Equilibrium.
And I was astonished. You got to remember, you have to remember that my mother was a socialist and had a Harvard education. I wasn't prepared to see markets work that well. So I thought, well, I keep trying this. Maybe it was an accident. Turned out, no matter what the configurations of supply and demand, they would find the equilibrium, and they had no idea what it was they were finding. They had no idea that they were not leaving money on the table. I never saw economics in the same way, and I stayed with experimental economics. That first experiment was done in January 1956. My first paper was published on that topic in the Journal of Political Economy in 1962. 63, I taught the first seminar in experimental economics at Purdue, and of course people didn't even know what experimental economics was. It's just been a blast. I believed then, from the 60s clear up into about 1982, 83, I had the idea, the misperception that all markets worked as effectively as those.
Okay.
Then, starting in 82, 83, Arlington Williams and I, a graduate student, we thought, well, no one's done any experiments with asset trading, where you can buy and resell an asset, and the asset yields some sort of utility, like a dividend. But let's see if we can design some experiments. We'll start with a real simple, transparent environment that they'll trade at fundamental value, and then we'll see if we can create bubbles. That was our idea. We started with an environment where people had complete information, and we reminded them each period what the fundamental value was. They paid no attention to that. So the question became not how do you create bubbles, but how do you make them go away? Or
the things that make bubbles more likely.
More money.
So if you inject money into it, you get more bubbles.
If I take two groups here with exactly the same parameters, except this group I give more cash relative to the value of shares in that system, and this less cash relative to the value of shares, this group will give me a larger bubble. Okay? And you can replicate that experiment. Bring people back a second time and let them trade in the same environment. The bubble it's still there, but it's not quite as big, and it doesn't have as much volume. Bring them back a third time, and they finally get it. They don't get there by thinking about it. They get there by experience.
A fun story about Vernon Smith, and I think I've mentioned this on my podcast before, but when I first met him at his offices at George Mason University, Vernon, who has Asperger's, I said to him, Dr. Smith, we need to set up all these lights. And it was like a typical college professor's office. I said, we need to set up all these lights and cameras and everything. And he was sitting at his desk working. And I said, do you want to excuse yourself while we get set up? I don't want to disturb you. And he just looked at me and said, Michael, I will never know that you are here. The intense focus that comes from, at least in his case, having Asperger's allows him to completely block out all and focus on the task at hand. In my lead-up, I mentioned Daniel Kahneman. I want to share a recent clip from Daniel Kahneman. And I think what's so important he says here, the algorithm. The algorithm in place of the individual discretion, judgment, jumping around, emotional, whatever. The algorithm puts handcuffs on our decision-making and is a huge improvement over us human beings.
That's actually, when people think about error, we tend to think about biases, systematic errors. But in fact, a lot of the errors that people make is simply noise, in the sense that it's random, it's unpredictable, it cannot be explained, there is no accounting for it. That is most of, I think, Many of the problems of the errors of judgment that we make originate not in bias, but originate actually in noise, in unreliability. So let me explain that a little more, because the concept of noise is pretty vague. There is a lot of literature that actually is not well known in the business world, which I find very surprising. There is a lot of literature on how unreliable professional judgment is. You put two professionals, you put the same X-ray in front of radiologists, and about 20% of the time in some experiments, they don't reach the same diagnosis. The amount of variability in people's judgments when you put the same case in front of people is much, much larger than people anticipate. We know that in a lot of areas, and there is another thing that we know that connects to noise. We know that in general, when you pit professional judgment, even expert judgment, against formulas, algorithms, simple rules that combine information, in general, the rules beat the experts. Actually, the result is this, that about half of the time in half of the studies, the rules beat the experts outright, and in the other half, it's a draw. There is little or no evidence of cases in which expert judgments do better than intelligently constructed formulas. And the reason for that, it turns out, is primarily noise. That is, it's not that people are biased. It is just that when you put some data in front of an algorithm, you will always get the same response at the other end. The output will always be the same. When you put the same data in front of an individual on two separate occasions, you're not going to get the same response. The indications from research are really unequivocal. That's the main reason for the superiority of algorithms over people, in that algorithms are noise-free and people are not. I'll give you an example from a large financial institution in which we've done some research, so that I'm jumping into the kind of consulting experience that you were mentioning. Oh, it's going to be difficult. They have professionals who are making judgments, and I can't tell you the kind of judgments, and you'll see why in a minute. But they're making judgments about quantities which are measured in dollars and in hundreds of thousands of dollars. And the decisions are consequential. It really makes a difference, the number that the individual produces. Now, a typical feature, and that is not uncommon, that happens in many places, is that a single individual typically makes that judgment. And you find that in a lot of places. You find that, among, in loan approvals, very frequently you have a single individual approving loans. You find that in insurance companies, an underwriter, a single underwriter can set policies for very expensively. Now, we actually conducted an experiment where materials were presented, were constructed by the professionals themselves or by some respected members of that team. They presented material that were completely realistic of the kind of judgments that people make. It would be nicer if I could tell you what it is, but you can imagine. It's in the vicinity of what professionals in large financial organizations do. We asked the leaders of that team how much variability they would expect. And the question was straightforward. If you take two people at random, two professionals at random, and they looked at the same case and they produced a number, which is their evaluation of the case, how much in percentages, how much do you expect them to vary relative to, say, the average of their two judgments? And you can probably guess the answer, because many people give the same answer, somewhere between 5 and 10%. That's what you expect. The answer is between 40 and 60%. It's an order of magnitude more. It's completely different from what anybody expected. And how it comes about that an organization has a huge noise problem and is completely unaware of it, that's an interesting question. There is advice that can be given. I mean, the obvious kind of advice is use an algorithm. Don't use judgment. I mean,
And how does that go over among the experts?
Not very well, but by the way, when you tell experts that when you tell the team leaders that there is 50% variability where they had expected 5 or 10, they're willing to take an algorithm. That really concentrates the mind. I mean, that's the contrast between the expectation and the reality. Now, so that's I would say the first thing you should look at. Is it practical to apply an algorithm? In many situations, it won't be. And then what you want to do is you want to apply disciplined thinking. You want to to lead people to think about every case that they do in a more or less standardized way. There is a lot of resistance to it, but actually it can be done, if it can be done in a way that the professionals will see as helping them rather than constraining them, then it can work. I mean, our experience has been fairly positive on what we call noise reduction. And I think it's a new field.
That's
I think it's quite an interesting field. And it's new in the sense that when people think of error, they think of bias and debiasing and cognitive biases and all that sort of thing. But in fact, noise is a big problem. You can measure noise, and that's a very important feature of professional situations. You can measure noise without knowing the correct answer. If you have, somebody in banking who is deciding on what is the appropriate rate for a loan, and you have variability, you have noise, you don't need to know what is the appropriate rate for that loan. What you actually can observe is that people don't agree, and if they don't agree, that's an error. Something is wrong if they don't agree.
And if you've not heard the episode with Daniel Kahneman on my podcast, episode number 212, I still think his sharing of his story as a youngster in Nazi-occupied France is so damn telling. What a fantastic story, and I was so lucky he shared it on my podcast. Next, I want to share a clip with Gerd Gigenrenzer. Gerd has appeared on my show several times. Episode 193 is one of his episodes. There are others. Go check them all out. What I love about Gerd is he takes the seemingly complicated and breaks it down to bite-sized morsels that we can all understand. And I love that he pushes the clarion call of statistical thinking. For if there is one thing that us human beings are just terrible at, it's thinking in terms of statistics. And for those of you out there that have an interest in trading, making money, investments, statistical thinking is 100% paramount. Job number one.
At the beginning of the 20th century, the science fiction writer Herbert George Wells made the following prediction. If we want efficient citizens in a modern technological society, we need to teach them 3 things: reading, writing, and statistical thinking. That is a good way to deal with risk and uncertainty. Now, today, almost 100 years later, we have taught in the Western world almost everyone to read and write, more or less, but not to think with risk and uncertainty. A TV newscaster once announced the weather the following way. The probability that it will rain on Saturday is 50%. The probability that it will rain on Sunday is also 50%. Therefore, he concluded the probability that it will rain on the weekend is 100%. We smile at that, but do you know what it means if you hear that there is a 30% chance of rain tomorrow? 30% of what? I sent my postdocs back to their home countries, in many countries in this world, downtown, to ask people what they think it knows. So I live in Berlin. Most Berliners believe that it means that it will rain tomorrow in 30% of the time. That is 7 to 8 hours. Others think it will rain in 30% of the region. That is most likely not where I live. Most New Yorkers believe both is nonsense. And it means something quite different. Namely, that it will rain on 30% of the days for which this prediction has been made. That is most likely not at all. Now, are people confused? We have a large literature in psychology that likes to point out one cognitive illusion after the other one. But the problem here is not so much in our brains, but in the experts who have never learned to communicate risk in an understandable way. In this case, to make clear to what class the 30% refers. Time, region, days. And if you have a little bit imagination, you can invent another class. For instance, one lady in New York said, I know what 30% means. 3 meteorologists think it rains and 7 not. The solution to this confusion is quite simple. Namely, always ask, percentage of what? But we don't teach that our children in school. We teach them lots of things, but not to think with uncertainty. We teach them the mathematics of certainty, not the mathematics of uncertainty. So we're causing, in part, what we're now observing. What I'm going to do today is to take 2 themes of this book, Risk Savvy, and the one theme is that understanding risk and uncertainties can save more lives and prevent us from more disasters that many technologies can do. That means we should invest in people, not just in technology and bureaucracy and stricter laws when something happens. The second theme will be about the difference between risk and uncertainty. In my first lecture, I talked about uncertainty, and the tools for uncertainty are heuristics and a few other tools. In the second one, I talked about risk in the medical context, and here probability theory can help when we can calculate the risk, but risk communication is the problem, as we just saw. So the second part of this talk will unify and bring together the 2 previous talks, in particular talk about the confusion between risk and uncertainty. So the idea that we could reduce all uncertainty to risk. And that's what most of the social sciences are doing. The idea that probability theory is the rational standard for everything. That will be the second part. So I'll start with 2 examples. The first one is about risk communication, how not understanding basic concepts in risk communication causes unnecessary fear and severe consequences. The second example will be about unconscious rules of thumb that make us fear of specific things and that are probably the product of our history of human evolution. But when we understand this much better, then we can actually deal better with them. Okay, so are you ready? Then we'll start. Great Britain has many traditions. The Queen, the tea, the scones, but also a few less tasty ones. One is the contraceptive pill scare. Since the 1960s, British women are frightened every few years with news that the pill, the contraceptive pill, causes thrombosis, that is, potentially life-threatening blood clots in the legs or in the lungs. The most famous scare went this way. The British medical institutions sent about 190,000 letters to doctors and pharmacists and called in a press conference for the following news. Study had shown that the third generation contraceptive pill increases the risk of thrombosis by 100%. 100%, that can't be more, isn't it? It's certain. Many British women went into panic and stopped the pill immediately, which led to unwanted pregnancies and abortions. What had this study shown? How much is 100%? The study showed that out of every 7,000 British women who took the previous generation pill, one had a thrombosis, which increased to 2 among those who took the third generation pills. So in terms of an absolute risk increase, it is 1 in 7,000. In terms of a relative risk increase, it's 100%. Relative numbers are frightening, but if the news would have reported the absolute numbers from 1 to 2 in 7,000, then probably no single woman would have panicked. And most would have thought, why are we told this? What you see here is the Sunday Times reported on the scare kiss of death. Is the pill doomed? That's the 100%. This single news caused an estimated 13,000 abortions in the following year in England and Wales. 13,000 more than usual. And particular high among teenagers. But it should be an easy thing to explain every teenager the difference between an absolute risk, 1 in 7,000, and a relative risk, 100%. But it's still not the case. Little emphasis is in making people risk savvy. Having strong people in our society who can take their life into their own hands. If something happens, if a crisis is coming, then we call for better technology, for more bureaucracy and stricter laws. One thing here for better pills, one thing that doesn't occur to us are more risk-savvy people. Second example. I guess every one of us remembers where he or she has been on September 11, 2001. And it seems to be that everything has been said about these tragic events. If you look at the 9/11 Commission report, you will find in 36 pages all that you want to know about Al-Qaeda, about the possibility of prevention, about bureaucracy like Homeland Security that was coming, on technology like full body scanners, and legal issues, so the further restriction of our individual freedoms. One issue that's not covered in this book is risk-savvy citizens. Why is this important? Imagine it is the year 2001. It's December, and you live in New York and want to get to Washington. Would you fly or would you drive? Who of you would fly? Half of you, and the others would drive. We know that many Americans stopped flying after 9/11. What did they do? Did they stay home or did they jump in their cars? I looked at the transportation statistics and found that for 12 months after the event, the miles driven increased by about up to 5%, in particular there where long-distance travel is happening on the interstate highways. As a consequence, in this time, an estimated 1,600 Americans died on the road in the attempt to avoid the risk of flying. The figure shows the number of fatal crashes so above and below the monthly average. And this is September 11. That amounted at this time to about 3,500 on average. And you can see there is a variability. And after 9/11, for 12 months, the actual fatal crashes were in every month above the average, and in the most of the times above the 5-year variability of the preceding 5 years. And then it went back to normal. And if you sum this up, then you get about 1,600 people who died on the road. And that's about 5 times as much as those people who died in the 4 fatal flights. Terrorists strike twice. First with physical force, and the second time through our brains, arising our anxiety. What is the anxiety that the terrorists exploit? It is a certain kind of fear. And one can formulate this in the following way. If many people die at one point in time, react with fear and avoidance. Note that it's not about dying per se. It's about dying together with many others. If the same number of people or more die distributed over the year, it's very difficult to elicit fear in us, as in car driving, motorbiking, cigarette smoking. And it's probable that this type of fear that I call dread risk fear is a kind of fear that was once rational at a time where humans lived in small groups, maybe 20 to 150 people, and where the sudden death of a part of the group was a threat for the survival of the rest. But that is no longer a real danger in our society, where we are no longer dependent of these kind of small groups. Nevertheless, it's very easy to elicit this anxiety. Think about the anxiety that Americans and Europeans had were for mad cow disease, for SARS, of swine flu, bird flu, and so on. All this alarming news where some scientific groups predict huge amounts of death that never occur, and where we then are frightened, at least as long as TV shows the story, and then it's gone. And we will worry about the next one. That's the same type of anxiety that we have.
If you've not had a chance to read Gerd's book, Risk Savvy, highly recommend. Go pick it up right now. Building on all of those bright minds, I want to play a short clip from Nassim Taleb, challenging everyone on banking, their understanding about banking, because we've got it all wrong. Now, some people might not like his sharp elbows, and I'm sure those elbows have smacked quite a few people straight upside their head. But more often than not, Nassim Taleb nails it, and he does so here as well.
Let me explain to you the problem of banking in this country ever since we had banking, or in the United States, or in the world now. You have an incentive for people to make money on a steady basis for a long time, claiming we take no risk. They bring some theoretician to explain to you that they're not taking risks because some metrics used by the economic establishment called variance, mean variance, all that nonsense doesn't show the risks. They're going to make money for a long time, and when they blow up, they lose everything. It's not their money. They're going to collect bonuses along the way. I worked for a long time as a trader. My fight was with people who claim they can understand the probability of an event happening, a rare event, particularly when they know theory, economic theory. So they give you a probability of something happening, losing more than X million dollars. These banks, comforted by these bogus measures of risk, were taking huge amount of risks for betting against rare events. Huge amount of risk by saying, oh, our quantitative risk manager, our scientist is telling us that we are safe. Same thing. My war was with Fannie Mae started, okay? When they said our scientists say that Mr. Taleb is not credible because look at it, we have 15 PhDs who say there's no risk. Well, you can have 15 PhDs or 500 PhDs. You cannot make this an arrogant bet.
In practice, what do you do now? If they're saying,
you make sure
into the G7 talks, what would you tell them?
The first thing I would get immediately, I would suspend something called value at risk, quantitative measures of risk used by banks immediately. Okay, I would stop anyone from using methods called mean variance. They got a Nobel for it, by the way. Markowitz mean variance, all that nonsense for risk allocation. I would stop Fidelity Investments from disclosing something called risk of portfolio, quantitative measures of risk of portfolio, okay, to their clients who may not understand what it means, that it's a bogus measure. What we have here is a reliance on bogus measures that led us here. The thing I've been trying to convince people, particularly with the Black Swan and other writings that came with it, some academic writings, is that the paradigm these people use, including tie-wearing economists and Harvard professor and all these, they think that they want to start, they understand the world, all right, and they want us to take action based on their understanding of the world. I do the opposite. I wake up every morning knowing that I don't understand what's going on, okay, and that is the way we're going to have to operate. Our understanding of the world has proven to be extremely weak, all right? So let's learn to be more robust to human error, more robust to error.
If you're making policy,
yes,
you might get that thrown back in your face. It's pretty hard. Olivia,
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things about institutions behind markets is that laws always are behind markets because markets are innovative. And so you essentially have to build up institutions. But the problem is a lot of the policy decisions are based on the last crisis. So I think we do have to have a bit more forward looking in terms of how to deal with what's likely to happen in the global economy. We can't know what we don't know, but there are some things that we might.
was talking there of the luxuries, if you like, climate change, civil liberties. Do these now go out the window in the face of people losing their jobs and their homes? Nassim Nicholas.
I don't know. I mean, I talk about things, all right, I understand. I don't talk, a lot of these forecasts don't work, okay? A lot of people, that's very rich. I'm a scientist, okay? I like things that are precise, experimentally known. What I don't know, I try not to let society take risks with it. So I don't know. Maybe it will pick up, maybe it will go down, maybe there's less money, maybe more money. I don't know. We have to learn today to face a world we don't understand, and it becomes very easy. If you know this is what I don't know, it becomes very easy to operate.
Ideologies at a stage of uncertainty often become more extreme. Do you think that's a position you're going to, whether it's the far right, the far left?
I have no idea, but I'll tell you one thing. You tend to think that the crisis, all right, is in its middle or toward the end. I think we may be in the very beginning. Okay, so when we start making comparison, we have to throw out everything we know out the window.
I love doing episodes like this where I pull together excerpts that really stimulate me, that force me to think, to remind myself the proper way. All of the wisdom in the world is out there today. The hard part is to know what's good, what's bad. How do you pick? How do you choose? Do you listen to everybody? Are you just the trusting soul that really can't tell your ass from a hole in the ground? You're going to get run over like a Mack truck every damn time. And one of the first steps to avoiding that smackdown, that run over by the Mack truck, get insights, get education from those that are the good ones. How do you know who the good ones are? Well, I'm telling you today. Go read every book, every article you can find by Vernon Smith, by Daniel Kahneman, by Gerd Gigerenzer, by Dan Ariely, and Nassim Taleb. And if you have a really backwards way of thinking, if you don't know which end is up, I will guarantee you, after you finish that homework project, you will absolutely know the right direction. Now, if you're one of those types that think you don't have to do the homework, you don't have to do the reading, you don't have to educate yourself, you just instinctively, intuitively know, you can bet the nuclear bomb will surely go off in your account one day. And that account might just be money. It might be life. It might be family. It might be friends. But if you don't want to take the time to absorb the wisdom from the right people, and I'm giving you a whole list of right today, you deserve every punch in the gut that you get. And it's only a matter of time until the hardest punch that can be thrown smacks you right in the solar plexus. I see a time when those awake will understand how to make money in up, down, and surprise markets. Whether new trader or experienced, college student or financial advisor, protecting against a crash or just trying to make a lot of money, trend following offers everyone an answer in uncertain times. To get started immediately, send me an email, michael@covel.com. I will send you the right trend following steps to take along with my free video. But if you want to buy and hold, trust the government and trust Wall Street, this is absolutely not for you.